Alright, Happy Death Day. I thought this movie would come and go and then never be talked about again, but it actually ended up being a big surprise for audiences, including me. So the movie, as you would expect, has been given a sequel. Should the first movie have been left alone, or does the sequel actually have a place in what is now a planned trilogy? We're about to find out. Let the battle commence. The story for Happy Death Day is based around a character called Tree. One day, Tree finds herself being stalked by a mysterious figure in a baby mask. We partake in a really well done horror scene, and by the end of it, Tree dies. As soon as she dies, however, she magically wakes up at the beginning of the day she got killed. She soon discovers that she is stuck in a 24-hour time loop, and the only way she can escape it is if she finds out the identity of her killer and stops them. This proves difficult, however, as it turns out that Tree is a horrible person who has made enemies out of the entire school. Consequently, she comes to the realization that she has to keep dying until she finds out who her killer is. After many failed attempts, she realizes that the more she lets herself get killed, the more damage it does to her internal organs. From here, Tree has to urgently find out who her killer is and must do so quickly. Otherwise, the next time she dies, she could stay dead and not wake up. Moving on, the story for Happy Death Day 2 continues right from where the first one left off, albeit it shows us from Carter's roommate's perspective, as in a strange turn of events, we find out that he is now the one who is starting to die and then wakes up at the beginning of the day, much like Tree did in the first film. Although it must be said, he catches on to it much faster than she did. And about 15 minutes later, the movie actually drops this part of the story and puts the focus back on Tree. Now this was slightly problematic to me, as the stuff that Carter's roommate was going through was actually quite interesting, especially when we find out who his killer is. But at that point, you kind of want the focus to be shifted back to Tree and the gang anyways, so although it was kind of a wasted opportunity, it was a smart choice in the end. So Tree is being thrown back into the same day that she was in the first movie, but things do not appear to be the same as they were the last time. Regardless, she is forced to relive her day again, and with the help of her friends, she tries to erase the time loop and return back to her time. Now the story for the first movie is very simple. It takes the concept of movies like Groundhog Day and Edge of Tomorrow and incorporates it into a horror scenario. And it took full advantage of the concept and really played around with it. And I would even go as far as to say that it did something a little better than both Groundhog Day and Edge of Tomorrow. And it actually gave this ability a serious drawback. That being, if she repeatedly dies, then it will have severe repercussions to her body. This adds a great deal of tension and even a time limit to her situation, and it raises the stakes to a whole nother level. Add to that the pacing and very tight structure, and you have a film that has no fat and is constantly taking you from one important scene to the next. As for Happy Death Day 2, it does what every good sequel should do. It expands on the first movie and gives us answers to some of the big questions that we had, and it even takes the time to answer the little curious questions, such as what exactly is Carter doing down there whenever Tree wakes up? Another little interesting detail that we get is that we are actually shown what is going on and causing all the racket outside in the halls whenever Tree wakes up. And it's little details like this that gives the first movie an additional layer of depth whenever you rewatch it again, and I absolutely love it when a sequel is able to do that. Now the part of the story that did not work with Happy Death Day 2 is the explanation as to how Tree ended up in the time loop. It makes absolutely zero sense and is unbelievably stupid. Now in the movie's defense, I really didn't think it would be able to pull this off at all, but as the film went on, I was surprisingly on board with its stupidness, and I was more than willing to just go with it. Now I have a very strong feeling that this is all down to the tone that these movies have established, because if this was a more serious movie, then we would all call bullshit. But seeing as these movies are comedies, I really couldn't get mad at it or anything, as this all strangely makes sense within this world. So although the explanation of the time loop is ridiculous, I am more than willing to let it pass. Now with regards to pacing, there was a place where the movie was actually going to finish and wrap up, but then a few people enter the room and do something which causes a big setback for our characters, and this setback causes the movie to go on for an extra 15 to 20 minutes. And from a story perspective, it made absolutely no sense. Even Tree, who has gone through the day hundreds of times, is thinking, this isn't supposed to happen, but it happens anyway. And at first you think the movie is going to explain how and why it happened, but it doesn't, and it became blatantly apparent to me that the movie was just padding itself out. It was essentially an excuse to give the film a bigger and more action-packed ending, and do you know what? It did actually make the movie better. I'm not kidding. If that setback didn't happen and the movie just ended right there, This film would have been a disappointment for me, but seeing as that setback did happen, the movie was forced to give us a new ending, and this means that the characters got to have even more interactions with each other, there were more reveals, and it all resulted in a great, fast-paced, action-packed ending which was even a little epic. But who would have thought? This is actually one of those times where lazy writing saved the day. So with that said, which of the two movies had the superior story? Well, I like the story for both films, and although the second film had an amazing ending, I still have to judge these movies on the quality of their stories. And although Happy Death Day 2 has a more complex science fiction narrative, that doesn't hide the fact that its story is still plagued with more problems and is also a bit clumsy in places where it shouldn't be. The first film, on the other hand, sets out to accomplish a very simple story and it succeeds with flying colours, and due to its simplicity, it leaves much less issues behind than the second film. And not to mention that I really am a sucker for these kind of stories where you get this really horrible and despicable main character who learns the error of their ways and becomes a much better human being by the end of the movie. When these types of stories are done right, I can't get enough of them. So when you take all that into account, the movie with the superior story is Happy Death Day. Now, all the characters in Happy Death Day are incredibly memorable. Main characters like Tree and Carter, nice name, are of course the standouts, but there are a bunch of side characters that also have very memorable faces and personalities, and the movie does a good job of giving them each their own distinct character traits whilst also shrouding them with a bit of mystery to keep you guessing if they have a secret dark side to them. And whilst all of the characters are not given a traditional arc per se, you kind of feel like they do get an arc, because as Tree continues reliving these days, we get to see more and more of these characters' personalities and the way in which they respond to Tree's various different reactions. And that carries through to the characters in Happy Death Day 2. Tree is in a different kind of time loop this time round, but some of the characters are still the same as they were in the first movie, and others, we get to see a completely different side to them. And even Carter's roommate gets to become more involved as well. So Happy Death Day 2 really excels with its characters. And then we get the two new characters of the movie, and I really didn't like these two. The best way I can describe them is that they really reminded me of these two irritants in Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, but something that Happy Death Day 2 does that Fallen Kingdom didn't, is that it doesn't force these two characters into the story more than it should. They play their part to advance the story, make a few jokes, and then we move straight back to Tree and the rest of the characters. That being said, as far as side characters go, they are really bad. As I said earlier, all the side characters in the first Happy Death Day are very memorable and have their own very distinct personality and look to them. So you remember their faces and their exact character traits. You don't get that same level of quality with these two. They look like two random as hell characters, and their character traits consist of the same old crappy comic relief. And by the end of the movie, when you figure out that they are now a part of Tree and Carter's crew, it's really off-putting. Especially when you take into account that this movie is going to get one more sequel. Now, both movies also have drama in them, and they are surprisingly very well done. The first movie has a scene where Tree is talking to her dad about her mother, and the second film has several emotional scenes, and it was even better than the scene she had with her dad in the first film. None of it felt like it was forced, and when it was all said and done, it actually raised the movie's score for me. Now, of the two films, which one had the superior characters? Well, I would like to call this round a tie, as both movies do their job. The first film gives us character introductions, and the second film gives us character expansions, but if I had to choose one, then I would give it to the first film. The character development felt much more focused, none of them were annoying or felt like they were shoehorned in, and the character arc we get with Tree is just so rich and is reason alone to watch this movie, whereas the characters in Happy Death Day 2, although great, are not as rich with development and don't have as much of an impression on you as they did in the first movie. So the film with the superior characters and character development is the first Happy Death Day. Now, the most surprising thing about Happy Death Day is that it is a comedy. The movie's marketing pushed this as a straight-up horror movie, but really, it has a big sense of humor. And this could have easily been a cheap way of lowering the movie's rating to a PG-13, but it actually fully embraced the comedic elements, and it knew when to use them, and it knew when to pull back and make the scenes more intense. But with that said, which of the two movies did the comedy better? Well, in the first movie, 99% of the time, the comedy pretty much always hit. But in the second film, I would say about 90% of the jokes worked and the other 10% were very shaky. They were either too over the top and silly, came from these two, or were just not executed well. I mean, there was one joke where Tree falls out of an aeroplane and before she hits the ground, she points both fingers at us, the audience. And that felt like an out-of-place fourth wall joke that you would expect from Deadpool, but not from this film. I mean, Happy Death Day is self-aware, but not that self-aware. So with regards to humour, the first movie had comedy that was all round better and more memorable. Does that mean the comedy in the second movie was bad? Not at all. As a matter of fact, I think the comedy in Happy Death Day 1 and 2 is so much better than the actual comedies we are getting nowadays. Even so, the comedy was better executed and more smartly written in the first film. As for the tone in both movies, well, the first film incorporates humour, but it also incorporates dark humour, which you would expect from films such as Scream. And of course, being in the horror genre, it also utilises a lot of traditional slasher horror, and it naturally manages to switch between the light and dark tones very effectively. As for the tone in the second movie, the comedy is good, but as I said, it did go over the top here and there. But probably the most noteworthy thing about its tone is that it dropped some of the horror element when compared to the first film. And this would be a bad thing, but it does make up for the lack of horror by throwing Tree into some very intense situations. And it does this so well that my knees were shaking with excitement as I was constantly on the edge of my seat anticipating what was going to happen next. And honestly, that more than made up for the reduced horror. And I can't believe I'm saying that. But having said that, the first film was also very intense and it stayed true to its horror roots. And because of that, I'm gonna have to give this round to Happy Death Day 1. The tone was more consistent, and when it got goofy, it never crossed over to silly territory. The same can't be said for the second movie. Now, Happy Death Day 2 has a consistent tone through a good chunk of the film, but whereas the first movie is consistent from beginning to end, the second film starts to waver, particularly during the last 10 minutes of the movie. And although I was laughing, there were times where I wasn't laughing with the movie, I was laughing at the movie. There is a fine line between something that is goofy and silly, and the first movie got goofy, but it never got silly like the second movie did. So the movie with the superior comedy and tone is Happy Death Day 1. So when you get down to it, these are both very good movies. They take the slasher genre and, much like Scream, throw in a few creative elements and in doing so, breathe new life into what would otherwise be a conventional slasher film. The first movie was great at taking these two genres and applying a new twist to it, and as a follow-up, the second movie tried something different and didn't just try to do the same thing that the first film did. It took risks and set out to do new things whilst keeping the core of the first movie intact, and in my opinion, it really succeeded. The love story in the second movie was also surprisingly good. I usually don't like rom-com kind of stuff, but this film did it better than any other rom-com I have seen, and I think that is largely down to the fact that it doesn't take up the whole movie. It was treated exactly the way it should have been, as a subplot, and it was a very good one. As for interesting bits of information about these two films, well, the second movie has a mid-credit scene, and on paper the scene had a funny joke, but the way it was shot and the music that was used just made it feel like it was directed in the same corny style as The Predator, and no movie should stoop to that level of horseshit. But seeing as this was the mid-credit scene, I didn't account the movie for it. As for interesting information for the first movie, did you know that it had an alternate ending? And this alternate ending was actually used at test screenings, but no one liked it and they went back in and changed it for its theatrical release. And let me tell you, if the first Happy Death Day went with that original deleted ending, I would have given it a 3 out of 10 with no hesitation. But thankfully, they didn't go with it, and I loved the movie a whole lot more because of it. Both of these films have this timeless quality to them, and that timelessness has been applied to all aspects of the movies. I really enjoy its pacing, the smart comedy, and the engaging and memorable as all heck characters. It's time for the scores. Happy Death Day 1 gets a 9 out of 10, and Happy Death Day to You gets an 8. As interesting and ballsy as the story was for the second movie, I just liked the more simple story in the first film a lot more. Does that mean I hated the story in the second? No, it doesn't. As a matter of fact, I really loved that story too, and I was easily able to excuse its flaws. But the story for the first Happy Death Day has this timeless and rewatchable quality to it, regardless of whether you know the secrets or not. Whereas the story for the second movie, I can't imagine that it will hold up to multiple viewings like the story for the first film did. Because instead of rewatching the movie to analyze the difference in continuity, you will be analyzing one writer's perspective on science fiction, which is infinitely less interesting to dissect than the continuity of the first film. Either way, both of these films are great, and I can highly recommend them. So that's it for another Versus video. If you guys liked it, please give the video a thumbs up, and let me know which of the two movies you preferred in the comments below. And don't forget to click that subscribe button if you haven't already, so you can stay up to date with my future Versus videos. Thank you very much as always for watching, guys, and I will see all of you next time. Take care.